My parents didn't just steal my inheritance. They stole 7 years of my life. I can still hear the judge's voice as he said one word that changed everything. Guilty. My mother lowered her eyes. My father stood there without showing a single emotion. While officers placed handcuffs on my wrists, the two people who should have fought for me stayed silent. Everyone believed I had stolen millions from my own grandmother. The truth was far different. I never took a single dollar. It would take 7 long years and one forgotten flash drive before the real story finally came to light. If you enjoy emotional true-style stories like this, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're enjoying the story, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. My name is Bryn Hale, and until I was 26 years old, I truly believed that family would always stand by you. My grandmother, Mavis Hale, spent decades building a successful commercial property business worth more than $30 million. Everyone assumed my parents, Grant and Lorna Hale, would eventually inherit everything she had worked for. Instead, Grandma asked me to help organize her medical records and estate documents during the final year of her life. I thought I was simply helping someone I loved. I had no idea that those files would later become the center of a criminal investigation. Just 2 weeks after we buried her, the estate attorney announced that nearly $6 million had vanished before the inheritance could be distributed. The next morning, detectives knocked on my apartment door. They accused me of forging legal papers, creating fake bank accounts, and stealing my grandmother's money. I was too shocked to even defend myself. Then my father quietly handed investigators a folder. Inside were documents with signatures that looked exactly like mine. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't a mistake. Someone had carefully planned every detail long before my grandmother took her last breath, and every piece of evidence pointed straight at me. The detectives turned my apartment upside down. Every drawer, every cabinet, every box was opened while I stood there trying to understand what was happening. After hours of searching, they suddenly announced they had found exactly what they were looking for. Hidden inside a storage bin were printed banking records, forged estate documents, and a flash drive they claimed contained stolen financial files linked to my grandmother's missing money. I stared at those items in complete disbelief. I had never seen any of them before. No matter how many times I told them the evidence had been planted, nobody listened. Every answer I gave seemed to make them more convinced that I was lying. Within days, the story spread across the local news, and strangers had already decided I was a greedy granddaughter who had betrayed her own family. The people whose voices mattered most never defended me. My parents stood in front of cameras looking heartbroken. They accepted sympathy from neighbors and family friends while refusing every phone call and letter I sent from jail. I kept hoping they would finally come see me and explain the terrible misunderstanding. They never did. When the trial began, I still believed the truth would come out. Instead, my father walked into the courtroom, took the witness stand, and calmly told the jury that he had noticed me becoming obsessed with Grandma's fortune during her final months. He claimed he had tried to warn everyone, but no one had taken his concerns seriously. Then my mother testified. She wiped away tears as she said she wanted to believe her own daughter was innocent, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Her voice cracked at exactly the right moments. Every person in that courtroom believed her pain was real. Their words carried more weight than anything I could ever say. Why would loving parents falsely accuse their own child? The jury returned with a guilty verdict sooner than anyone expected. As officers locked the chains around my wrists, I turned for one last look at my parents. The tears were gone. They quietly embraced each other with small, satisfied smiles that lasted only a few seconds. That single moment stayed with me through every lonely night behind prison walls, reminding me that the people who had destroyed my life had never believed I deserved to keep it.
The first year in prison felt like a lifetime. Every morning I woke up hoping it had all been a nightmare, only to see the same gray walls and hear the same heavy doors closing behind me. The hardest part wasn't losing my freedom. It was realizing how quickly people erased me from their lives. Friends who once promised they would always stand beside me stopped writing. My phone never rang during the few times I was allowed to make calls. Even the people who knew me for years decided the headlines were easier to believe than the woman they had shared their lives with. My fiancé lasted only a few months before ending our engagement in a short letter. He wrote that he couldn't spend his life waiting for someone convicted of stealing from her own grandmother. I read those words so many times that the paper became worn at the edges. The career I had worked so hard to build disappeared overnight. No employer wanted to be connected to someone the newspapers called the granddaughter who robbed her dying grandmother. My name became a warning instead of a person. After hearing the same accusation over and over, I began questioning my own memories. I knew I was innocent, yet the constant judgment slowly wore me down. Some nights I wondered if the truth even mattered anymore. One person refused to accept the official story. Grandma's estate attorney, Cade Mercer, kept reviewing the case long after everyone else had moved on. Something continued to bother him. My grandmother had carefully written every important financial decision in handwritten journals she kept for years. They weren't ordinary notebooks. They were detailed records of meetings, payments, investments, and changes to her estate. When investigators searched her house, every journal had disappeared. No one could explain where they had gone. At the same time, my parents' lifestyle changed in ways that made no sense. They purchased expensive cars, traveled constantly, and spent money far beyond the inheritance they had legally received. The numbers simply didn't match. Kate believed there was a missing piece hidden somewhere behind the evidence. Then one afternoon, a plain envelope with no return address arrived at his office. Inside was something that would change everything. When Kate opened the plain envelope, he found only a single photocopied page. There was no note, no name, and no clue about who had sent it. At first, it looked like an ordinary page torn from one of my grandmother's journals. But the moment he recognized her neat handwriting, he knew it deserved a closer look. Most of the page contained routine notes about meetings, property payments, and upcoming appointments. Then his eyes stopped on one sentence written near the bottom. If anything happens to me before I finish updating my estate, Bryn must never sign anything without Cade present. That one line changed everything. Why would my grandmother write such a specific warning? She trusted very few people with her personal affairs, and she had always been careful with every legal document. If she felt the need to leave those instructions behind, she must have believed someone would eventually try to use my name for their own benefit. Cade couldn't ignore the possibility. Without telling anyone, he began reviewing the old estate records again. He requested copies of every document that had been filed during my grandmother's final weeks. As he compared dates, signatures, and medical reports, another disturbing pattern appeared. Several important estate papers had supposedly been signed while Grandma was in hospice receiving heavy medication. According to her medical records, there were days when she was barely awake, yet official documents claimed she had approved major financial decisions during those same hours. The timeline simply didn't make sense. It became clear that whoever framed me hadn't stopped at copying my signature. They had also forged my grandmother's handwriting to make every transaction appear legitimate. Even with those discoveries, there was still one major problem. Suspicion wasn't enough to overturn a conviction. After 7 years, finding proof that could stand up in court seemed almost impossible. Then Cade remembered a conversation he had shared with my grandmother months before she passed away. She once mentioned keeping a secure backup of her most important estate records in case anything unexpected happened. If that backup still existed, it could expose the entire scheme. The only problem was that nobody knew where she had hidden it, or whether it had survived all those years. Weeks passed without any new answers, but Cade refused to stop searching. Before the estate closed permanently, several old storage boxes were scheduled to be destroyed. They had been sitting untouched in a warehouse since my grandmother's death because everyone believed they contained outdated paperwork with no value. Cade decided to inspect them one last time. As he sorted through dusty files and empty folders, something caught his attention. One filing cabinet felt heavier than it should have. After examining it closely, he discovered a hidden compartment beneath the false bottom of one drawer. Inside rested a sealed envelope covered with years of dust. There was only one handwritten message on the front. Only if something feels wrong. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was an old flash drive. When he plugged it into his computer, dozens of carefully organized files appeared on the screen. The first folder contained video recordings of private meetings between my grandmother and her longtime financial advisor. In every conversation, They discussed protecting her estate and making sure her final wishes could never be altered without proper oversight. Another folder held scanned copies of original legal documents. Each genuine signature was placed beside a forged version. Even without expert training, the differences became impossible to ignore. Someone had copied both my handwriting and my grandmother's with incredible skill, replacing authentic records with fake ones that supported the theft. The next folder contained several early drafts of Grandma's real inheritance plan. They showed how she intended to divide her assets fairly before unexpected changes appeared in the official paperwork. Then Cade opened one final video. My grandmother looked directly into the camera, speaking calmly, but with obvious concern. She explained that she believed Grant and Lorna had been pressuring her to change parts of her will. She admitted she no longer felt comfortable discussing financial matters around them and wanted a record of her concerns if anything suspicious happened after her death. For the first time in 7 years, every missing piece started fitting together. The evidence had been hidden in plain sight all along, waiting for someone who refused to give up. But finding the truth was only the beginning. Using that flash drive meant reopening one of the state's biggest fraud convictions, a legal battle that would force powerful people to answer questions they had spent years avoiding. The discovery of the flash drive changed everything. Cade wasted no time gathering every file, recording, and document before filing emergency motions to reopen my case. What had once seemed impossible was now backed by evidence that could no longer be ignored. The court approved a new review. Independent forensic handwriting experts were brought in to examine every signature connected to the missing money. They spent weeks comparing the original documents with the forged versions found on the flash drive. Their conclusion was clear. The signatures used to convict me were not genuine. Someone had carefully copied both my handwriting and my grandmother's to create a false paper trail. At the same time, financial investigators reopened the banking records that had been accepted without question during my trial. This time they followed every transaction from the beginning instead of stopping where the original investigation had ended. The results were shocking. Not a single dollar had ever entered my personal accounts or passed through any business connected to me. Instead, the money moved through several shell companies that appeared legitimate on paper, but existed only to hide ownership. Those companies were secretly controlled by a longtime business partner of my father, Grant. From there, the funds quietly made their way into accounts connected to both of my parents through a series of complicated transfers. Every payment, every account, and every date matched perfectly. The truth that had been buried for years was finally impossible to deny. As more records came to light, the prosecutor, who had led my original case, made an unexpected admission. Important evidence that could have helped my defense had never been shared during the trial. Whether it had been overlooked or intentionally withheld, the result was the same. The jury had never been given the full picture before deciding my future. One by one, the foundation of my conviction began to collapse. For the first time since the prison gates closed behind me, I allowed myself to imagine what freedom might feel like again. Hope slowly replaced the hopelessness that had followed me for 7 long years. Then, only days before the new court hearing, investigators arrived at my parents' house with search warrants. The house was empty. Grant and Lorna had vanished without telling anyone where they were going. My parents didn't disappear for long. The moment investigators realized they were missing, federal agents began tracking their financial activity, phone records, and travel history. At the same time, the court ordered dozens of bank accounts connected to them and their business partners to be frozen. Years of hidden transactions were finally coming under close examination. The pressure closed in quickly. Grant and Lorna knew the evidence was growing stronger every day. Instead of facing the new hearing, they made plans to leave the country. They booked flights using a carefully prepared travel itinerary, hoping to stay one step ahead of investigators. They never made it onto the plane. Federal agents stopped them at the airport before boarding began. In front of confused travelers, both of my parents were taken into custody. The same confidence they had shown during my trial disappeared as cameras recorded them being escorted away in handcuffs. The story spread across television and newspapers within hours. For years, those same reporters had described me as the greedy granddaughter who stole from her dying grandmother. Now they were asking a different question. How had such a carefully planned fraud remained hidden for so long? As new evidence became public, the answer was becoming painfully clear. While the investigation continued, another court order arrived at the prison where I had spent the last 7 years of my life. My conviction had been officially overturned. A correctional officer opened my cell and quietly told me it was time to go home. I packed the few personal belongings I still owned into one small box. Everything else had been lost to time. Walking toward the prison gates felt strange. I had imagined that moment thousands of times, yet when it finally arrived, I wasn't sure how to feel. The world outside had moved forward without me, and I had to learn how to live in it again. People expected anger. Some expected revenge. What I wanted was something much simpler. I wanted the truth to be spoken in the same courtroom where my life had been destroyed. I wanted every lie exposed in front of everyone who had believed it. Only then could I begin putting the pieces of my life back together. The final hearing was approaching, and for the first time in 7 years, my parents would have no choice but to face me. The courtroom was filled long before the hearing began. Reporters lined the back rows, attorneys filled every table, and people who had followed my case for years waited quietly for the proceedings to begin. 7 years earlier, this same room had taken everything from me. Now it held my last chance to clear my name. The evidence was presented piece by piece. Large screens displayed every forged signature that had been used against me. Handwriting experts carefully explained the differences between the genuine documents and the fabricated ones. They showed how small details, invisible to an untrained eye, proved the signatures had been copied rather than written naturally. Next came the financial records. Bank investigators walked the court through each transfer, following the missing money from one account to another. They demonstrated how the funds had moved through shell companies before reaching accounts connected to my parents. The paper trail was complete, leaving very little room for doubt. Then Cade asked the court to play the video recovered from my grandmother's forgotten flash drive. The room became completely silent. My grandmother appeared on the screen, calm but serious. She explained that she feared Grant and Lorna were pressuring her to change parts of her estate plan. She said she wanted her concerns recorded in case anything happened before she could finish updating her legal documents. Hearing her voice again after so many years filled the courtroom with an uneasy silence. When the recording ended, my father tried to blame financial advisors and business associates for everything that had happened. My mother insisted she had simply trusted the wrong people and never understood what was taking place. Neither explanation survived cross-examination. Each answer was challenged with documents, bank records, emails, and the recordings my grandmother had left behind. Their stories changed again and again until they finally contradicted themselves. The truth was impossible to escape. After reviewing all the evidence, the judge looked directly at me before delivering the words I had waited 7 years to hear. He declared that my conviction had been based on false evidence and officially recognized me as completely innocent. The courtroom that had once taken away my future had finally restored my name. But even after justice was served, there was still one decision only I could make. The weeks after my name was cleared felt almost unreal. For so long, every part of my life had been controlled by prison schedules, court dates, and headlines that painted me as a criminal. Now I woke up each morning without locked doors or guards watching every move. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was finally mine again. The legal battles didn't end with my release. A civil court ordered that the stolen inheritance be returned, along with financial compensation for the 7 years I had lost because of my wrongful conviction. No amount of money could replace birthdays, holidays, or the life I should have been living, but the judgment acknowledged the damage that had been done. People expected me to rebuild the luxurious life my parents had chased. Instead, I made a different choice. I used a large part of the settlement to establish a legal foundation that provided support for people falsely accused of financial crimes. Many couldn't afford experienced attorneys or investigators, and I knew exactly what happened when innocent people had no one willing to fight for them. Helping them gave purpose to everything I had survived. As the truth spread, old friends slowly returned. Some admitted they had believed the headlines without asking questions. Others said they had been too afraid to stand beside me when public opinion turned against me. A few relatives reached out with tears, asking if I could forgive them for staying silent while my life fell apart. I listened to every apology. Some sounded sincere. Others felt like attempts to ease guilty consciences. I learned that forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. I could let go of my anger without pretending the past had never happened. While I was rebuilding my future, Grant and Lorna faced sentencing in federal court. The evidence left little room for mercy, and both received lengthy prison terms for fraud, conspiracy, and related financial crimes. As they were led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help thinking about the years they had stolen from me. Now they would spend years behind bars themselves, finally understanding the true cost of taking someone else's life apart. There was only one place I still hadn't found the strength to visit. It was the place where this entire story had begun. A few days after everything was finally over, I drove to the cemetery where my grandmother had been buried. For 7 years, I had avoided that place. Every time I thought about visiting, I remembered the funeral, the investigation, and the day my entire life fell apart. I wasn't ready to face those memories until now. The morning was quiet as I walked slowly toward her grave carrying a small bouquet of fresh flowers. I knelt beside the headstone and gently placed them on the ground. For a long moment, I couldn't find the right words. Then I whispered the sentence I had carried in my heart for years. "I'm sorry they turned your love into my nightmare." Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't the same tears I had cried inside a prison cell. Those had been filled with fear and hopelessness. These came from finally knowing the truth had survived, even when everything else seemed lost. For a long time, I believed prison had taken away my future forever. I thought the best years of my life had disappeared behind concrete walls and locked doors. Looking back, I realized those years had also taught me resilience, patience, and the value of never giving up, even when the entire world believes you're guilty. Eventually, the stolen inheritance was returned. My reputation was restored. People finally knew my name for the right reasons instead of the wrong ones. But none of those victories meant as much as one simple moment inside that courtroom. After 7 years of waiting, the judge looked at me and said the words I thought I might never hear. "Bryn Hale, you are completely innocent." No amount of money could equal the peace those words brought into my life. As I stood and prepared to leave the cemetery, I realized I wasn't carrying hatred anymore. Holding on to anger would only keep me tied to the people who had tried to destroy me. My parents had stolen 7 years of my life. They had taken away opportunities, relationships, and memories I could never recover. But they had failed to take the years that still lay ahead. I walked away from my grandmother's grave with hope instead of bitterness, knowing that my story would no longer be remembered for the lies that sent me to prison, but for the truth that finally set me free.